as you know, we're really honored to have a couple representatives from 21st Century Policing Solutions here to do a presentation. And just have a couple of quick opening remarks, some logistics, and we'll introduce everybody at the table. And if you could fill out your name card, that would be most helpful. So my name is Christy Hammett. I'm the Interim Assistant City Manager, and I have been working with Chief Kearns. We've been working on the community municipal justice system initiatives for probably about the past 2-3 years, trying to figure out what are the best strategies to implement and thinking about moving forward and supporting the community. So as part of our work, you might recall that the Budget Committee has asked us to return to council with some recommendations about identifying gaps and strategies for moving forward. And so we're preparing for that. And in part of our preparation for that, we reached out to 21st Century Policing Solutions consultants to provide their expertise in helping us think about strategies that align with best practices. And much of it is continuation of the work, a lot of the work and program changes that are already happening within the Eugene Police Department. So I'll just give you a little bit of background, and I don't want to take too much time because I really want to have time for the presentation and question and answer period afterwards. So in 2014, President Barack Obama signed an executive order establishing the Task Force on 21st Century Policing. This task force was charged with identifying best practices and offering evidence-based recommendations on how policing practices can promote effective crime reduction while building public trust in local communities across the country. Released in 2015, the task force report provides a blueprint for implementing 21st century policing concepts and practices by local law enforcement agencies and other criminal justice providers. As part of tonight's meeting, 2 of the task team members and principal consultants of 21st Century Policing, former Philadelphia Police Commissioner Chuck Ramsey and Sean Smoot, will offer a presentation on the task force recommendations and will be available to discuss implementation of these recommendations in the context of the City of Eugene municipal justice system. The intent of this presentation is to inform advisory board members and other key stakeholders about the task force recommendations and best practices identified by the 21st Century Policing Task Force, and provide a context for future discussions about our community and public safety needs and how our municipal justice system can best address them. The presentation will also be provided at the City Council work session tomorrow at noon. And there's a lot of background on our 2 consultants that we have here. They have a well-established history of experience, and in addition to the work that they've done in the Presidential Task Force, and each of you received a copy of their background information at your spot. And I also wanted to mention there's another link to the work that we're doing to try to make sure that we're up to speed on kind of what's happening across the country. And as you know, our police chief, Kearns, is retiring. And as we recruit, as the city manager is recruiting for our police chief, one of the goals that he has established is trying to recruit someone with experience and understanding and knowledge about the best practices in 21st century policing. And Chief Kearns, do you have anything you would like to say?
No, thanks.
Okay. Well, we'll miss you. So with that, I think the next thing that we'll do, if it's okay, we'll just go around the room really quick. And if you could say your name and, or the table, we'll go around the table so nobody in the back has to worry about that. And Chief, we'll start with you.
Sure. Pete Kearns, Eugene Police Chief.
I'm Will Davey. I'm on the Police Commission.
Chris Mackey, Eugene Police.
Michael Clues, EPEA. Bill Whalen with the Police Commission. Travis Smith, City Prosecutor's Office.
Terry Robinson, Police Commission.
Maury Danner, Civilian Review Board.
Mark Gissner, Police Auditor.
Can I introduce myself over there? Use.
I'm Sean Smoot from 21st Century Policing.
Chuck Ramsey, 21st Century Police.
So, thank you guys. A few things logistically. There's, we'll go for till 7:30. They'll get through their presentation. There'll be a time for questions. Are you willing to take questions during your presentation, or would you prefer?
Sure.
Okay, so if you have a question, just go ahead and ask it. Did everybody that's sitting at the table that's part of an advisory board get a chance to sign the sign-up sheets? Okay. Well, if you haven't, please let us know so we can make sure that you do that. And let's see. The other thing I was asked to mention about the logistics, if you are parked in the library parking garage, please be advised that the garage closes at the same time the library does at 8 p.m. So make sure that your vehicle is out of the garage before that time so you don't get locked in the garage. So, but we'll make sure that we're finished. And with that, I think I'll go ahead and turn it over to Sean.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming out tonight. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about kind of the philosophy of 21st century policing and kind of give you the highlights of the report that Chuck and I were able to and honored to work on for President Obama. Just by way of introduction, and I apologize, I'm a little froggy in the throat. I'm on the back end of the cold. I hope I'm on the back end of it. Just by way of introduction to our company and what we do. In addition to Chuck and myself, we have two other principal consultants. Ron Davis, who was the previous director of the COPS office at the Department of Justice, and Roberto Villasenor, who served with us on the task force and is the retired chief of police from Tucson. We also have a number of associate consultants, pretty well-known folks in the law enforcement and police reform business. Chuck and I, in addition to doing the work, the consulting work with the 21st Century Policing, we also both serve on consent decree monitoring teams in Cleveland and Baltimore currently. So just by way of a little bit of background, and you can read the actual final report at the website there, and I think, are there copies of the slides that people got?
Yes, everyone.
Okay, so you should have the website there if you want to actually read the report. I think it's available there in its entirety. But you know, why did President Obama form this task force? Well, pretty self-explanatory. As you know, anybody who watches the news knows there's been a great deal of attention drawn to the national issue of mistrust between police and the public. A lot of things kind of got exposed in the last 3 or 4 years, and strains between the police and communities that they serve and the relationships there. And so the president convened a task force and basically appointed us in December of 2014 and told us that he wanted a report, an interim report, the first part of March 2015. So doing the math, and somebody has, but I think, you know, we were told we'd have a certain amount of time. We actually have about 57 days to put together the full report. I think if you take the time to read it, you'll see that it covers a lot of ground, and every major issue that is going on in policing now, and that has been going on in policing for the last decade, is addressed. That doesn't mean it's the buy-all and end-all. We were on a very tight time frame, and we didn't get to get into as much detail as we necessarily would have liked to if we had had more time to do it. But I think it's become kind of the guiding principles for policing moving forward since its release in 2015. Chuck served as chairman of the task force, along with his co-chair, Lori Robinson, who's one of our associate consultants from George Mason University and former Department of Justice Assistant U.S. Attorney. The report itself is broken down into 6 pillars, or what we call pillars. You might call 6 different sections. They're listed there. I'm not going to read the slide to you, but we're going to go through each pillar and try to give you a good sense of what's behind the pillar and what our recommendations were and some action items that police departments are taking around the country. You want to jump in?
Well, first of all, it's good to be here with you this evening. We're going to just kind of go back and forth on these pillars, and that's been an awful lot of time on it because We want to engage in conversation, which I think is going to be more beneficial to all of us here. We did have 6 areas, and as Sean mentioned, we had a very, very compressed time frame. I mean, this started off, when I got the phone call, it was, I think, right around Thanksgiving, when, you know, the phone rang and look at the caller ID and it said White House. Well, that doesn't happen every day, so it kind of got my attention. And it was the general counsel to the president who told me that the president was thinking about putting together this task force based on 2 incidents that had occurred, one Ferguson, Missouri, and then New York City at the time. Now, there have been many since then, but those are the 2 that really kind of started this whole thing, and whether or not I'd be interested in co-chairing, which of course I was. It started off as a conversation where we might have 6 months to do it, and we met with the president, and it went from 6 months to 90 days. And then after we left the president, we got another return phone call, and it wound up being like 47 days. But we had to have a report on his desk. So, as Sean mentioned, this isn't meant to be a list that is all-inclusive. It's our thoughts at the time around what are the 6 key areas that we really need to spend some time that we have putting together a report. You look at areas or at issues like recruitment, hiring, staffing. I mean, we didn't get into that in any great detail, but it doesn't mean it's not important. It just means we didn't have a chance to get to it. And quite frankly, we all kind of thought that this would be kind of a basic report, but then we would build on it as time went on, dealing with other critical issues affecting policing. One of the very first recommendations in the task force report is that the president form a commission or task force to look at the entire criminal justice system, not just police. The last time that was done was in 1965 when Lyndon Baines Johnson was president of the United States. Now, we all know a few things have changed since LBJ was president of the United States. So it's time to take that kind of comprehensive look again. Unfortunately, that was not done. It was a tail end of President Obama's time in office, and he didn't think it could get done in time. So what we have here is just focusing on police, although more work needs to be done elsewhere. When we list the pillars, they're in no particular order with the exception of one, and that is the first one. Building trust and legitimacy. That's the one that we thought was important enough to address before we address anything else. Because unless we have trust and the legitimacy that we need to have in order to effectively serve our communities, nothing else matters. And so that's why we made that the very first pillar. And so we talk about transparency, we talk about accountability, we talk about concepts like procedural justice, for an example, where people feel they have a fair shake, that we're actually listening to them, that their voices are being heard. But it's not just about procedural justice with the community. We're talking about internal procedural justice too, because we can't expect the men and women of our departments to go out there and treat citizens a particular way when we don't treat them that way internally. And so you've got to look at it really from both perspectives. On that previous slide, I mentioned fair and impartial policing. That now is going to be touched on again when we get to the one pillar that deals with training and education. But that's another area that we wanted to deal with. Because there are issues in many of our communities, particularly our more challenged communities, where, you know, that's the basis for the lack of trust and legitimacy in the eyes of the public has to do with, quite frankly, the way they've been treated in the past, historically, by police. And we live in a society now where it doesn't matter if the incident occurs in Eugene, if it occurs in Philadelphia, we are linked together, whether we want to be or not. I mean, we started this whole thing off talking about Ferguson, Missouri. Now, I grew up in Chicago. I never heard of Ferguson. We used to go to St. Louis all the time because I had relatives in St. Louis. I had to get a map to find out where the heck Ferguson was. Never heard of it. But who would have thought a city with 50,000 residents and about 50 police officers would change policing in America? Yet it did. And so we have to think about these things and take it serious, because it doesn't matter, small, medium, or large, issues are issues, and we have to be in a position to deal with it. So I talked about procedural justice, internal procedural justice. In our report, one thing has kind of gotten a little bit of traction, although at the time we were talking about it, We didn't realize it would, and that was this whole idea of a mindset, guardian versus warrior. You know, and it's, I think we could have spent a little more time kind of explaining what we mean by that. But the mindset is one of really being a guardian to the public that we serve. You know, we're there to protect people, not just from the standpoint of protecting them from crime and disorder, but also protecting their constitutional rights. I mean, when you stop and think about it, police officers, when they are sworn in, you know, they raise their right hand and they swear to protect the public, but they also swear to protect people's individual constitutional rights. And so we need to focus on that too, because if we really looked at our job that way, as being guardians, as opposed to just fighting crime, being at war, we're not at war with our communities, then I think we'll start to have better outcomes. So that whole guardian versus warrior mindset, which actually started with Sue Rohr from King County, I believe it is, in Washington State. She has her training now, but she was the sheriff there for a period of time. She's the one that really kind of coined that phrase. And so I don't want to go through every bullet point here because you can kind of see from here exactly some of the things that we're talking about. But it is about changing the culture of police, which does take an awful lot of time in order to do that. As we start going through these different pillars, they're all intertwined. We'll be touching on a lot of different areas there. The next is policy and oversight. You wanna-
Yeah, so this actually was an area that I was directly involved in drafting as part of the report. So Pillar 2 kind of builds on, as Chuck said, all the pillars kind of build on Pillar 1. Pillar 2 builds on those ideas, really talks about the idea of co-production. It introduces the idea of co-production, of not only co-production of public safety, but co-production of policing. And in that respect, what I'm talking about is actually community having input into policy and oversight, and the importance of that element. Some other things, you can go to the next one, Chuck. Some other things that we talked about, in particular,
Well, that's good.
like, come on, man, I didn't do this for you.
All right, get me started here again. Who's my tech person?
Probably. One of the things that we talked about under policy and oversight, and this is actually getting a lot of traction now, is a mechanism called Sentinel Event Reviews. These are things that are peer reviews. They do them in medicine all the time. The NTSB does them anytime there's a near miss in airplane collisions or anytime there's an accident in public transportation. And what Sentinel Event Reviews do is that you bring in all of the people who were involved in the event. They sit around a table. It's non-blaming. Nobody's getting disciplined. Based on this information sharing, it's protected. It's protected in both medicine and transportation by federal law, so that people can actually figure out what happened. And so if there's a mistake in a surgery, for instance, somebody winds up operating on the wrong arm, there's a Sentinel Event Review. The doctors, everybody, from the nurse to the janitor that cleaned the operating room, everybody gets around the table and they walk through the entire event. And the reason that they do that is to identify what the root cause of the operation was, of operating on the wrong arm was. We strongly recommended in the task force report that police departments start doing Sentinel Event Reviews. NIJ is currently doing them, has a grant program, they're doing them in 10 different jurisdictions, researching the efficacy of those in policing. And OJP, the Department of Justice, has now expanded that program so that between 20 and 30 additional departments are going to be doing a Sentinel Event Review. So one that's fairly close by is Salt Lake City. I know that I'm working with them on that project. Nice going, man.
Hey, it must have been beyond me. Even our tech is having some issues here.
Click.
We'll just pretend.
Yeah.
Well, good thing we have hard copies.
So some other highlights to policy and oversight. We made specific recommendations about use of force policies, We made specific recommendations on review of critical incidents. We made specific recommendations on having outside agencies come in and review and actually conduct investigations where there's an officer-involved shooting. We talked about a lot of things. These were the hot button issues, like I said, when I started. We addressed every major issue that was going on at the time. So mass demonstrations, we addressed it under this pillar. How those things are handled. Searches, identification, specific protocols for LGBTQ communities, and searches that go on there. Training. We pretty much ran the gamut. The overall theme of this, though, was not only, there's over 18,000 police departments in the United States. I know this might be hard for you to believe, but some of them don't have any policies and procedures. And so part of this was like saying, you've got to have a policy, and then you've got to include the community in developing that policy and informing them of what the policy is. And once you have it, you have to update them on a regular and recurring basis so that your policies stay up to date using best practices.
Can I just add
Yeah,
one thing to
of course.
that whole thing around policy review and input from like oversight group or whatever? We had some issues in Philadelphia around use of force, officer-involved shootings. And we were revamping our policies as we were revamping training and all that sort of thing. You can be in this business so long that we use a particular kind of language to communicate with one another, and we assume everybody understands it. And so as we drafted policy, we gave it to the oversight group that the mayor had actually put together. And they had some valuable input, because when they read it, they couldn't really understand it, because to them it wasn't clear. And so the revisions and the changes that we made as a result of their feedback made for a stronger policy. And because we're so used to just putting stuff out, because we always put it out in a certain language, the way we communicate with one another, but they had a different set of eyes looking at it. And I found it to be very, very useful. So again, we talk about oversight, but we didn't get into any particular model, because one thing we made clear, it should vary from city to city. That's an individual decision that a city and its department need to come to, because there is no one model that is like the model. There's pros, there's cons, there's stuff that works, there's stuff that doesn't seem to work so well. So it's up to each individual city to actually do its own thing.
Back away from it.
Yeah. The next one is technology and social media. Social media has clearly changed everything in terms of how we communicate. Facebook, Twitter, there are platforms out there that I don't even know they exist. I mean, there's so many of them that are out there now. But they're used every day as how we communicate now as a society, or at least many people in our society. So like I mentioned earlier, it doesn't matter where an incident happens. Information travels so fast now, it's traveling in just about real time. And that doesn't mean that information is necessarily accurate, but we got to deal with it. Whether it's accurate information, inaccurate information, we have to be in a position to be able to deal with it. At the same time, departments have to be more aggressive in getting their own message out using social media platforms. We don't have to wait for mainstream media to write a story about something we may be doing in the department or in the city that could be of benefit to our citizens. We can be very aggressive and put our own information out as well. As far as technology, there were some people that were disappointed that we didn't talk a lot about body-worn cameras. The reason we didn't talk about body-worn cameras, maybe 2 paragraphs devoted to that. The reason is we didn't want to date the report. Technology is evolving so fast that we can't really keep pace with it. It's certainly moving faster than the law or policy can keep pace with it. I mean, just body-worn cameras, for an example, when I was commissioner in Philly, this is before we started our pilot and went into the body-worn cameras. This was several years ago. Some of the other departments that had already started using it, and I said, well, we're not doing it yet. And Chief told me, he said, well, you still need to have a policy in place, because what was happening in some departments, cops were going out and getting their own cameras and wearing them. And if you had no policy in place, then you had another kind of problem. So again, the use of technology can evolve. But the bigger question to me is how we use technology as police within a constitutional framework. That's the discussion that needs to happen, in my opinion. Because today we're talking about body cameras, you're starting to hear stuff about drones, but we need to be thinking about how we use it and do it in a way in which we protect people's constitutional rights, we don't abuse it. For example, many departments have license plate readers. Okay, you drive down the street, it scans tags. If a hot one comes up, one is stolen, it gives out an alarm, and you can either recover the car or arrest the individual who's in a hot car. One or the other, right? It's great. People tend to like that. It's good. Okay. What happens when that same manufacturer decides they want to put facial recognition software on that? So now instead of going down the street scanning tags, you scan faces. I'm not saying that's necessarily right, wrong, or whatever. But just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it. And so we need to think about these things and have thoughtful discussion. We need to get the Bar Association, ACLU, community, we need to get everybody at the table and say, okay, what's the right way for us to be able to go about doing our job more efficiently and more effectively, but we don't violate people's rights. Because if we don't do it ourselves, guess what? The court's going to do it for us. And I guarantee you the restrictions they put on us probably is not going to be in anybody's best interest. And so we need to have these discussions up front, so as departments start to implement these different things, they can do it. And that's really kind of a focus of the technology piece that we put together in pillar number.
Yeah, one other thing I want to just add to that is one of the big lessons that was learned from the Ferguson event was that when no information comes out, that vacuum gets filled. And it really got filled in that situation through the use of social media. And so, I believe the incident itself happened. I don't think the department actually put out any information for 3 days. And then when they did put something out, it was a video of the man who had been shot involved in an altercation with someone in the convenience store beforehand. For 3 days, if you followed it, and I happen to live in the same media market as Ferguson apparently, because I had it 24/7 for 3 days, that story got written and rewritten. And if you go back now and read, there were not one but 2 federal investigations that were done. Very thorough. And 90% of what came out in those 3 days turned out to be totally false. You had people coming up doing in-person eyewitness interviews for news stations saying that they saw things. It was later proven that they were not even in the city when the event occurred. And so if you looked at Facebook, if you looked at Twitter really drove a lot of people to Ferguson from around the country to protest. And a lot of that turned out to be based on false information. And so one of the things that we talked about, particularly in terms of social media, is that departments need to leverage social media themselves. That doesn't mean, you're limited. If there's an ongoing investigation, there's only so much information that you can share. But you should say something, because if you leave silence, other people will fill that silence, and they'll use social media to do that. And you can really spin something into an incident into something that it didn't even occur.
So one example of the Boston bombing, Boston PD was very aggressive in their use of social media during that incident. And there was a major news net outlet, CNN actually, that reported that they had an individual in custody, and it was not true. And they were able, through their Twitter feed, to make it clear, no, the suspects are still at large. We don't have anybody in custody. So you can correct some erroneous information that comes out. You're not going to stop it all, but you can at least put something out. So that was really where we kind of focused on that. The next one is community policing and crime reduction. One of the things that Sean mentioned earlier is this whole notion of co-producing public safety as being a goal. That's something that Ron Davis, one of our principals in our company, he was executive director of the COPS office, came up with. And I think he's very right. You know, I've had the opportunity to serve in 3 different departments. Chicago, spent 30 years as a member of Chicago PD, 9 years in DC, and 7 and 8 years in Philadelphia. And in my early career, you know, I mean, I had never heard of community policing. You'd be hard pressed to find someone who actually is, you know, less of a, more of a believer than I am in community policing. It is the only way, I think, to provide policing services. Now, the models vary from city to city, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but if we don't have close relationships, and it almost ties back into Pillar 1, then we're not going to really be able to really fully realize our potential as police. So that's very important. Young people, again, you know, usually you go to these meetings and it's always, you know, it's older folks talking about what they think is best for young people, and yet the voices of young people are not heard. And so, you know, we got to pay attention to our young people. We got to hear what their concerns are. We got to develop relationships with young people. They communicate totally differently. Again, in Philadelphia, one of my deputies came up with an idea of creating a youth advisory council. We had a regular advisory council, but we had one of youth. And so, you know, these are, you know, 20-something-year-olds and teenagers. They come to the meeting. It's not like the meetings that I'm accustomed to. They all got, you know, 2 or 3 different devices. I mean, and they're sitting there and they're tweeting and sending stuff out as we're talking. I mean, it just, yeah, what are you doing? But it's a whole different mindset and a whole different way of communicating. But they can reach a whole population that we tend not to be able to reach. You know, and that's just reality, you know? And we have community meetings. Everybody doesn't want to go in the basement of a church at 7 o'clock at night to have a community meeting. A lot of people just want to do it just online, and you want to have virtual town halls and things. We need to listen, because the concerns and the issues of young people are just different. And it's not like they were when we may have been that age. They live in a whole different era. They have different challenges, and we need to be mindful of that and really pay attention to it. So that one is key. And it also kind of ties into crime reduction in a way, and I'll let Sean take this. But we have to find ways to keep kids out of the criminal justice system, not put them in the criminal justice system. And so diversion programs and ways in which we can keep kids on the straight and narrow and not do stuff that, you know, they're not the first folks to, you know, make mistakes growing up. For those that are involved, and I'm not talking about, you know, shootings and some of the more serious stuff, but there's a lot of stuff that we can take and we can divert them elsewhere, not saddle them with a criminal record at a very young age. It's going to change the course of their entire life. So we need to really focus on young people and ways in which we can support them and keep them moving forward.
Yeah, I just, a couple of things I wanted to touch on. Again, this goes back to this whole idea of co-production, and that it's everybody's job. It's not just the police department's job to create a publicly safe community. And the way that you kind of get everybody on board is by actually doing community engagement. Engage with the various neighborhoods that are in your community, with the different groups. Involve them in the strategy for addressing problems within their community. There's a number of ways to do this. You can do it on a community-wide basis. You can have the whole city involved and have a group put together that kind of addresses citywide issues. But you can also do it on a very micro level. And if you look at departments, Seattle has a really good micro-community policing program where they literally will drill down to just about a 6 square block area and come up with a plan with the people who live in that 6 square block area, and to not only identify issues that are going on in their community, but also identify potential solutions. And it really gets them to engage. Not only does it build a stronger relationship between the police department and the community, it also solves the problems. And it's a force multiplier for the police, because now you have community members who are on board. They're on board with not only identifying the problems, but with helping you get the solutions. And it's not like they just expect that they're going to pick up the phone and the police are going to come fix it. They're going to be part of fixing it. And that's really what this whole idea of co-production is about. Again, I think, when you engage in that, you engage the community in that, you can open it up to a number of different approaches to do that. And I know that Eugene does some of that already. And I commend the chief for that, because it takes a commitment. It takes an investment of work and an investment of time and an investment of manpower to get that kind of engagement going. The other thing, and Chuck kind of touched on this, and I think that it's part of the whole idea of the community policing and engaging the community in crime reduction is to really think about what tactics the department's deploying and what the impact of those might be. Not just on youth. I know one of the bullets on here is about youth, but also on the community itself. And so, one of the popular kind of catchphrases and philosophies, or I guess, I don't know if it's a tactic, but this broken windows policing. The idea that you really pay attention to the small things. And that's important, and it's proven, there's research that shows that it really works. However, there's also another side to that, which is if you're really nitpicking on broken windows and graffiti in communities where the people, that you're picking on the people that can least afford to deal with those issues. And so you have to really just kind of think through that idea or that tactic. If we're going to really, let's really beef up traffic and parking enforcement in this area, is that going to have a disparate impact on a certain portion of the community? And the answer might be yes, and if the answer is yes, it might not be the tactic you want to use.
Or at least be very mindful of it and understand the collateral damage that's caused by those kinds of things. And I think, that's something, and Sean mentioned broken windows, which, that strategy can work. And I mean, these are the nuisance complaints that really can destroy quality of life in the neighborhood. But you also have to have a plan on what to do once the window's been repaired. In other words, whatever the original problem was that caused you to focus, at some point in time it's corrected. Well, you can't keep doing the same things that you did to correct it once it's been corrected. And so that's where you got to be mindful. What do you do when the window is fixed? And how do we get the community more involved so they can maintain whatever gains you had and so forth, and you can move on to other things. But that's got to be part of the strategy and not just keeping on, doing the same thing over and over again. You want to jump in?
It doesn't matter. So the fifth pillar is focused on training and education. Again, you see a recurring theme here, involving community members in these things. So, even though somebody's not part of law enforcement, that doesn't mean, as Chuck said, sometimes you bring in an outsider and they look at something and they have a whole different perspective on it. And it actually comes out being a better product because you got their input. I think policing, I've been involved in policing not quite as long as Chuck.
Even though you're as old as
not even nearly as long as Chuck. But I think we've done a really bad job of explaining to people what we do, how we do it, and why we do it that way. And let me just give you an example. A lot of times people's very first and only, by the way, interaction with the police officer is when they get stopped for speeding or some other traffic enforcement issue. And if they get stopped at night, it's very likely that the traffic stop will go down something like this. They will be blinded by a light from the back of their car because we put takedown lights on squad cars, we put spotlights on squad cars. Somebody will approach the back of their car, and if this is the driver, they will stand back here and they will tell them, to keep their hands on the steering wheel or don't reach into the glove compartment. And they will tell them at some point, they will have a direct conversation with them, but they will stand behind them so that you can't really see them. And if you turn to look, you kind of get blinded. And they might not, like, it's not going to be a friendly conversation to start with. Like, hey, how's your night going? Might go something like, do you know why I stopped you? If that's how the transaction takes place, and by the way, that's how officers are trained to conduct that stop. Because for their safety, they have to stand behind the person. They have to have the car illuminated as much as possible. That's to avoid them getting shot, but the driver doesn't really go through that analysis at that time. And so, if the officer goes through that traffic stop situation and doesn't take a second, once it's over, whether the person gets a ticket or not, and this gets back to procedural justice, and if people feel that they were heard or that they were treated fairly. If the entire conversation takes place like this, and the officer is very tentative and he takes care of his business in a very tactical, and by the way, 80% of the way that officers are trained to do, after that traffic stop occurs, if they don't take 30 seconds to say, hey, I don't know if you've ever been stopped by the police before, but I want to explain to you why I stood back here when I first approached your car. I wasn't trying to be a jerk. I did that for my safety. I'm trained to do that. I'm trained to approach a vehicle in a certain way. That's for my safety, to prevent me from being killed. Because police officers sometimes have walked up to cars and been shot. And I hope you don't take offense to that, but I just wanted you to know that's why this traffic stop occurred in this way. A 30-second, 1-minute explanation, and there's research on this, which we cite in the task force report, by the way. That person doesn't care whether they got a ticket or not. They care about how they feel when they drive away. And if the officer explains to them why they did it the way they did it, they don't have a problem with it. Even if they got a ticket, it literally doesn't matter what the outcome was. What matters to them is how they think they were treated, and if they thought they were treated with respect.
Can I just add one quick thing,
Yeah.
just to give you an example of how some training has changed? Reality-based training is something that a lot of departments now are doing. That's scenario-driven, where you create a scenario, much like what Sean described, where tactically, from a tactical point of view, making a car stop, was a faulty car stop or whatever, but you don't quite know what you got. That's one thing. One of the things we started doing in Philly, for an example, is that we would have trainers that would observe officers making this mock car stop, right? There's been a report of a robbery of a convenience store. They're driving a blue Chevy, occupied 2 times. Here's a blue Chevy, 2 occupants, 2 blocks from the scene. So they make the stop, and somebody's evaluating, they make a proper stop, all that sort of thing. But then you find out it's the wrong car. And they made more than one blue Chevy when they made blue Chevys, right? And so how many times have you been out there, right? You start off thinking you stopped a car that was involved in something, but it turned out not to be the right car. We added one more trainer. That trainer's job is to listen to the conversation between the officer and the driver, who's going to be upset because they got stopped, to see how well they de-escalate the situation. That's something that's kind of a new wrinkle in a lot of ways, because again, it gets back to how do you leave it. It may still be, but at least you're trying to help develop that skill for de-escalating situations, as opposed to just, there's a tipping point where you realize that you're not, even if you eliminate that car on a traffic stop, well, this person's not a threat. At what point in time do you start to de-escalate your approach and start handling it differently, as opposed to continuing to treat it as if it is that felony car stop, as it is somebody who could possibly harm you? And so it's having officers kind of go through that to understand at what point in time do you back off, or if you really got what you thought you had, what steps you take from that point on as well. So it really kind of cuts both ways, but that's scenario-based training.
And I think
which
that's
is recommended in our
yeah,
report.
and I think that, again, to kind of close the loop on training and education, the element of educating the community about the training that officers get. Because people out in the community really don't typically, unless they have just a real strong interest in it, they're not going to know what the training is that an officer gets at the academy or in continuing training at the
Right. So the last pillar, and Sean, I know this is your passion here, wellness and safety. You kind of stayed on that one, so we both jump in on that one.
Sorry, cough. So the final pillar was officer wellness and safety, and we really looked at a number of issues, but probably predominantly mental health was one of the key ones. I think it's no surprise there's a very high suicide rate in policing as a career, and there have been, those numbers have been pretty consistently high. And unfortunately, situations occur where officers haven't been trained to identify potential problems in their coworkers. And so one of the things that we talked about was actually making sure that officers get sufficient mental health training, not just to be able to deal with folks that have mental health challenges on the street, but also to be able to identify if there are issues with people that they work with. And with the aim and resources to get those folks help before things get totally off the rails. We talk a lot about addiction, alcohol issues, and again, training not only on identifying those problems, but also, we specifically recommended that Congress devote a significant portion of the budget towards programs that would allow officers to have the ability to get help if they need it. And that's really an area where we don't invest very much as a profession, and where the government, the federal government in particular, has not invested a lot. The other thing we did was we really talked about focusing the department on, having the department focus on wellness and safety across the board. So, for instance, if a department is looking at new squad cars, that they would actually do an analysis and look at the types of seat belts that are in the squad cars, if those were sufficient, if they operated well with the equipment that officers have to wear, which a lot of them don't, as those of you who are police officers know. And really kind of doing a health and wellness assessment anytime a new piece of equipment or a new tool comes into the department's use, actually having officers test that stuff and assess it from the standpoint of, hey, does this add more weight? Is this going to cause back problems? Is this going to work getting in and out of the car? Those types of things. So, really kind of making it a concentric part of the analysis that the department goes through from start to finish, whether it's picking out new shoes or a new type of weapon to use. And then just, part of the culture change in policing is allowing and fostering an environment where these issues can actually be talked about, because that's not typically what you see in policing or the military or a lot of other professions of that type, of this type. I think that's changing a little bit because people are just more accepting of mental health treatment, but also recognizing mental health challenges and other challenges. And but it's not changing fast enough, and the culture of this profession is still a very kind of macho, tough person. Nobody wants to admit that they need help. Most people that go into policing do it because they want to help other people. And so it can be a challenge. And that's one of the things that we also talk about, is kind of changing that culture to make it and create spaces where officers can talk to each other and get help if they need it.
Well, mental health still carries a stigma, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon, unfortunately. So this is an area that we got to really focus on. to make sure that officers are able to get the kind of assistance that they need should they have some issues. You know, what we do in policing isn't normal. I mean, for the average person, I mean, you get exposed to stuff that's just not normal. I mean, over time, you develop, you know, mechanisms to kind of deal with it, whether it's dealing with murder, rape, robbery, I mean, on a daily basis. That's not normal stuff. And post-traumatic stress disorder isn't limited to soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. You do this stuff for 20, 30 years and being exposed to it. It takes a toll, and resiliency only goes so far. And it's not just what you're exposed to on the street, it's what's happening. I'll give you an example. My first year as police commissioner in Philadelphia, 2008, in a 9-month period, I had 5 officers killed in the line of duty. 3 shot to death, 2 in auto crashes responding to felony and progress calls. A month before I took over that department, they had another officer that had been shot to death when he was making a premise check and walked in on a robbery in progress and got shot and killed. Now, obviously, that took a tremendous toll on the officers, and it took a tremendous toll on me. And we formed a partnership with the University of Pennsylvania Behavioral Health because our employee assistance program couldn't handle that kind of trauma. And so we got actual counselors from Penn to help us, and I made everybody go through it, myself included. Because you have to take this seriously in terms of, because that can translate into other behavioral problems later on down the road. And so if we don't deal with it up front, we're going to wind up with some problems down the road. And as Sean mentioned, police have a higher percentage of alcoholism, higher rate of divorce. You name it, we probably got more than our share of it. And a lot of it, I think, is due to stress and due to that sort of thing. So we have to be very proactive in that area. So we spent a lot of time in this one, at Officer Safety and Wellness. And actually, we kind of, after we thought about it, made it the last pillar to kind of be the bookends of trust and legitimacy in officer safety and wellness. Because when it's all about officers behaving in a professional manner all the time, but we have to take into account some of those stressors and things that really impact an officer's behavior over time. Not to excuse it, but to identify it early on and deal with it.
So just kind of to tie this together, obviously you've heard me talk about co-production and engaging, and really, what we talked about was partnering, and you see that referred to a lot throughout the report, and it could be something that's highly formal, it could be something that's just, really informal. The key thing is to be open to the partnerships on the side of the police, but also people in the community have to be open to partnering with the police. And this is totally a two-way street. I think that we identified a lot of different ways to do that in the report and with some recommended action items. But the key thing is the police can't do public safety by themselves. They have to have the support of the community. They have to have the community involved in it. Frankly, the community has a lot to do with defining what public safety means. Because, for some people it means I don't feel at all hesitant about letting my son go across the street and play in the park. For other people, it means, I don't have to worry about walking across the street and getting shot. That definition changes depending on who you're talking to. But the bottom line is the community really has to define it. And in that, they also define whether or not they think police are doing a good job, whether or not they're being successful.
And so in the end, we all know the police has changed. The 21st century has its own set of challenges. It's going to require a different mindset on the part of police, and it's going to require us to rethink who we hire, how we train, how we retain individuals, how we serve our community. And what we tried to do in the task force report was begin the conversation, to have meaningful conversation around these issues. It wasn't meant to have all the solutions, because, I mean, I don't think anybody has that. But at least open the door for conversation and continue to move the profession forward. I'm very pleased to say that, many departments are still working toward trying to implement many of the recommendations in the report. Many were already doing some of the recommendations in the report. I mean, your chief has been very involved in doing a lot of innovative things over the years. So it wasn't meant to be that, light bulb going off, oh my God, why didn't I think of that? But it's just to get back to the very basics, to how we provide service, and how we keep our people in a position to be able to be the kind of guardians that people expect us to be, and how we can get the community and other stakeholders more involved in the co-production of public safety. And that's pretty much it.
I mean, we'd really
I wanted to
welcome.
kind of zip through this to get some comments and questions.
We built in almost an hour for conversation, so we would welcome any questions or comments and be happy to engage in that.
That last slide is where you see that one up. Anybody contact
Oh, yeah.
Here's our contact information. if
Right,
you
and
get hold of us.
anybody that has a copy of the slides also received that. So if you have questions, why don't we start first with people that are sitting at the table? And if there are other questions, we'll work to get to those too. So
Great.
is there anybody that has a burning question or comment or? No?
I think it's more of a comment, but I'll phrase it as a question. You talk about training and education, and you don't talk, at least in the summary, directly about how you train isn't the right word, expose new employees to the communities they're working in relative to their job. And yet that's really important.
Yeah.
Even in your traffic stop scenario, where the stop occurs and all of that. And it seems to me that that's a fundamental part of the mindset that you're looking for.
One of the challenges we had, because there are close to 18,000 police departments in the United States. Fact is, I don't think anybody really knows the exact number, but that's the one that's always thrown around. Small departments, medium departments, big departments, state, local, federal. How to write a report that really touches everybody in some way is very difficult. But let me give you a concrete example of some of the things, one of the things that we did in Philly. I'll use Philly as an example, but we talk about this as we work with other departments. And this isn't a one-size-fits-all, so just because I'm saying it doesn't mean this is what everybody ought to do. You have to do what's best for your community and your department, whatever fits. But for Philadelphia, one of the things that we started police recruits out when they graduate from the academy and they get assigned to their districts, they start on foot patrol in some of the most challenging neighborhoods in Philadelphia. Philadelphia has some challenging neighborhoods. So we're not talking about just walking down commercial corridors checking the businesses. We're talking about where you got drug trafficking, where you got prostitution, where you got all these kinds of things going on. Well, there's a couple things. One, Temple University did a study that actually showed that there was a 22% reduction in the areas where we implemented foot patrol versus the control areas where we didn't. So it's a legitimate police person. It's just not a feel-good thing. But the more important thing, in my opinion, police officers learned at a very early point in their career that even in the most challenged neighborhoods, there were more decent, law-abiding people living there than were criminals. And they learned that because they were walking and not driving 40 miles an hour down the street in the Crown Victoria. They actually had to interact with folks. Walk by somebody sitting on the stoop and say good morning and have a conversation. Understand that most of the kids just want the same thing your kids want, and that's an opportunity to move forward. They're not gang banging. They're not doing whatever. They may live in some challenging areas and have some challenging circumstances. That doesn't make them bad. And so, you learn those things. So that's one way of really trying to understand the community and really trying to, put yourself in a position where, you can start to break down some of those barriers. The other thing we started, because I think it's important, history teaches us an awful lot. Philly's fortunate enough to have the National Constitution Center located there in the city. And I stopped by there one day and just to see what they did in there. It wasn't just a museum where you walk around and look at stuff, but they actually have training programs. Well, they got training programs. And what they do is they have programs where they talk about the evolution of democracy from the inception of our country all the way to the present day. I asked them, what if they traced the history of policing during that same timeline? Now, in 1776, you didn't have organized police departments, but maybe you worked a plantation and your job was to chase down slaves. When you look at Bloody Sunday, what later became known as Bloody Sunday, who was waiting for the protesters that crossed the Pettus Bridge? Police. And so understanding that as a profession, we carry a lot of baggage in some communities that doesn't exist in others. So why is it more challenging for us to build trusted relationships in, let's see, a largely African-American community versus another community? Some of it has to do with the history of policing in the United States. So it's not to condemn, indict, or none of that stuff. It's to open the eyes and understand. We're hiring 20-year-old kids. That's history. Like they weren't alive during that time. I was. They weren't. They need to be exposed to it because you can't build bridges until you know what the issues are, what the problems are, and the challenges that you have to face. My wife and I watch Joel Osteen quite a bit. He's a well-known minister on TV. And I was watching one of his sermons one day, and I forget what he was actually focusing on, but he made a comment that kind of stuck with me, and he said, there's a reason why the windshield of a car is bigger than the rear view mirrors, because it's not designed for you to spend too much time looking at what's behind you. You got to look forward, take an occasional glance. You don't spend all your time doing that. But that's kind of what this is. We're not saying focus and dwell on it, but we're saying you need to at least know it's there. Know where you've been before you can figure out where you need to go. And so I think things like that start to bring education into policing more than just, you're good at training. You teach you how to, with the crimes code and how to make out this report, how to process an arrestee and all that stuff. But it's the educational component. Understanding the role of police in a democratic society. I mean, those are the kinds of things that we start to focus on now, more and more. Fair and impartial policing, bias that exists, and learning how to deal with your own personal biases that you may have.
And that type of training, and particularly about the history of policing in a democratic society in the United States, is now mandatory training in several states, even at the academy. So like in Illinois, the state where I'm from in Illinois, that's a mandatory course that has to be included in basic training.
Yes.
So I got a comment and a question. I'm, especially for the different administration, we have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the prison population. And we know percentage-wise the color of the skin of most of the people in our prison system. So I'm a little disappointed that police was isolated, mostly because of media-generated interest, social and otherwise. And I hope that at some point in time there's some progress on that, and I know that you have the connections to hopefully drive that initiative, because it is an embarrassment in the world that we have 25% of the world's prison population. And so I hope you can drive that. My second thing is, if you had the experience doing it, I just read a well-written report about an officer that went to a suicide. And I'm sure that he wrote his report, went home. And I doubt very seriously if anybody's ever going to talk to him about it or anything that happened. I doubt very seriously if he's ever going to admit that he was impacted by it. You've been to enough officer-involved shootings. I've been to enough. Every one of them I remember back clear back to 1986. I remember every one of them. So how do you, as a leader in a police organization, open this up? Not only just from a dialogue standpoint, but from a resource standpoint.
Well, there's two, let me take the first question first. The very first recommendation, which we call an overarching recommendation, was to create that commission to look at the entire criminal justice system. That would have dealt with mass incarceration, that would have dealt with everything. Because it would have dealt with policing, it would have dealt with prosecution, courts, probation, parole, corrections. What are those drivers in our society that lead to crime? You know, lack of education, poverty, all those kinds of things. Unfortunately, that wasn't acted on, and I hope that a future administration does that, because until we deal with the entire problem, it's not going to get any better. It's really not going to get any better. We have to have some very honest discussion around these kinds of things, and if we're going to have alternatives to incarceration, what exactly are those alternatives, and what kind of resourcing are we really going to make available to make sure that that it's robust enough to be able to handle people who need some kind of corrective action, but not necessarily jail. And so we need to really have serious conversation around that. Officer safety and wellness is why we address that second part of your question, because you're right. I mean, some people self-medicate, they drink. You know, they do a lot of things, and you don't always realize. You know, listen, I worked in homicide when I was in Chicago. And Chicago obviously has more than its share of murders. So, you know, you go to these scenes and, you know, you build up a wall so you can do your job. I mean, and so it's almost robotic when you go through this process, because if you really stopped and thought about the tragedy of somebody losing their life, no matter what the circumstances, you couldn't do your job. Now, there are some things you see that really get you. For me, it was small children. That's what got me. You know, you got to go to the morgue and observe an autopsy. There's nothing worse than looking at some 4 or 5-year-old child split open that's been, you know, a victim of child abuse and murdered, or sexually assaulted and murdered. That tears at your heart. But how do you deal with that? And that's where this whole issue of making sure that officers have the kind of resources available to them for psychological counseling on a regular, ongoing basis, because that takes away the stigma. Because cops aren't going to just voluntarily do it. You know, well, we make them go if they get involved in a shooting. We make them go if they get shot. I mean, we do that sort of thing. But it's the day-to-day stuff that they get exposed to that falls under the radar, like you just said. The suicide that might have, we're all different, might have bothered me, but might not have bothered you that much, for whatever reason. We have to understand we're all individuals, and resiliency is something that's, you know, I think needed in our business, but, you know, different people have to see the same incident and have 2 totally different reactions. And that's why you got to really make it so it's kind of like, be aware and just make it as a regular annual thing, as far as I would like to see, where people actually went through some kind of counseling, at least every other year, depending on the size of your Philly's department is so large that there's no way it can get everybody through in a year. But having something in place, that's just a personal opinion, but I think it's not.
Yeah, another part of that is making sure that your supervisors are trained to recognize someone's in crisis. And there should be some pretty common sense, like, policies in place that say after an officer's been involved in a particularly heinous scene or a really bad situation, their supervisor, instead of saying, you know, okay, you're cleared from the call, go to the next call, come into the station, I want to talk to you. You know, their sergeant should talk to them. You okay? You just recovered a child's body from a traffic accident. You feeling all right? Maybe you need to go home for the rest of the day. You want to talk to somebody? Instead, what happens in a majority of places, unfortunately, is the officer gets done, they clear the scene, and they go to the next call. And we've actually seen sometimes what happens as a result of that. There was a very well-publicized case of a police officer who responded to a pool party where kids who weren't invited to the pool party showed up. And this officer, this particular officer, was videotaped basically really manhandling a young high school-aged girl who was clearly not a threat. She was in a bikini. She didn't have a weapon. And he's throwing her on the ground. And he actually lost his job as a result of that. The previous call that that officer was at, he attempted to resuscitate a baby who had died and was not able to do so. And I would suggest that that whole episode, I would say his supervisor bears some responsibility because he didn't check in with him after that call. You know, did you just respond to a dead infant? You tried to resuscitate the dead infant, and it didn't work. I'm sorry that happened. You know what? Why don't you hang out at the station for the rest of the day? I want to check in with you before you go home. That didn't happen. What happened was the infant went in the ambulance and went to the morgue, and he got in a squad car and he went to the pool party. This is a guy with an unblemished record prior to that. So, just an example, but I think that's really what we need, and a little bit more proactivity on the part of police agencies to look at those situations and say, you know what, when you go to a fatal accident, or you go to a homicide scene, or you go to, you deal with a child abuse incident, we're going to check in with you before you go back on the street.
But here's one of the challenges that we have as police leaders. You know, you can't realistically have counseling sessions for a homicide guy every time he goes to a homicide.
Right.
Because that's what he does, right? And so if you can't handle that, then you shouldn't be in homicide. So at some point in time, you gotta really be able to have something in place where you periodically sit down with these individuals, because it's not necessarily the one case all the time, it's the combination of constant exposure to it that causes the problem. And that's where regular sessions I think would benefit, because that officer may not even realize that he's being affected that way, because you build up defenses, you really do. And people take that, though, as being insensitive and being detached. So you get complaints. That officer didn't care, that officer was blah, 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 blah. Well, there's a reason for that. And I think we need to all think about that. But there's a couple other dimensions to this. I mentioned all the police officer deaths I had. The first one I had, May 3rd of 2008, a sergeant by the name of Steve Lisbitsky, responded to a robbery in progress, and he was able to locate the offenders. He's by himself, and before he can stop the car, they jump out, open up with an SKS assault rifle, and kill him. And the next day, I remember getting ready for work. Maybe it was 2 days after, but it was right within a very short time frame. And my wife says, you need to come out and look at this. And so I came out of the shower and I took a look, and I'm looking at the television, it's Fox News. And they got a helicopter shot of a car that had been stopped, and they got 5 cops. And they are on these guys, and these 3 guys, and they're wheeling at them, right? They're beating them, that's what they're doing. And I remember saying to her, where's that at? She said, Philadelphia. And I was, oh man, I knew what kind of day I was going to have, right? Well, after we handled that case, and a couple of them got fired, so we went through it and we were able to deal with it. But I had my research and planning division go back and look at incidents where officers had been killed or shot and match that up against complaints for excessive force. There was, without question, a very clearly defined spike with the first day or 2 after an incident like that occurred. Why? They're angry, they're upset, they're hypervigilant, all these kinds of things. So what we started doing is when an incident like that occurs, we actually, those officers that worked in that unit, now I came from that Philly PD is 6,800 sworn, so you have some flexibility to do some things you can't do in a smaller department. But what we would do is relieve that group, backfill with other officers, people who went through the academy with them, grab them, make them go through counseling, all that sort of thing, so that we didn't have that, because you could anticipate that immediately following that something was going to happen. And so again, it's trying to understand what's going on there and the emotions that exist when you have these kinds of events take place. Policemen are human beings like everybody else, not robots. You stay at roll call with a guy, and an hour later he's on a slab in a morgue. I mean, you're not going to be real happy about that. Not an excuse for excessive force, but if you can anticipate it, you intervene early on. And that's the point of being able to have something in place so you can intervene before it becomes a problem in terms of behavior of officers. And again, not everybody goes through that sort of thing, but you'd be surprised at some of the things that we witness. You got a gentleman in the back there, nobody else at the table.
Go ahead.
Thank you, President, to the people at the table. You're all far more engaged with this than I am. But I have read the report. And there are three things that I would like to touch on, if I could. The first is the crisis that brought about the setting up of the commission was not just strictly one of lack of confidence between the community and the police, even Stephen. It was because of modern technology allowing many people to see constant examples of excessive use of force in all parts of the country. In many cases, just on police body or dashboard camera film. And in no case, in any of those, did one see an officer going, hold it, take it easy, John, step back, you know, I got this, calm down, it's okay. And not infrequently, several officers joining in a meeting. And in each case, afterwards, not in each case, but in many cases, there's seemingly a lot of tolerance by district attorneys, departments, and their supporters that, yeah, well, it was justified, 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 and they aren't. In fact, one police chief in the re-engineering training conference that was held following your commission made the point when he said, we've all seen those videos, and we can't justify it, can't defend it. So the crisis is a little sharper, I think, than you posed it, and it's worth keeping, I know you're aware of it, I know we're all aware of it, but it's important to say it, because otherwise the crisis would not be at the level that you're clearly addressing.
Well, the president wouldn't have called me if it was only two things that happened. I mean, he
well,
saw
there were
things.
lots of things that happened.
No, but he
did
see some things.
Those
yeah.
are the ones that
right.
I knew about.
Right.
Yeah, and there have been, I must have seen 100 of them since. Okay, but to tie that together with a lot of things, you've been saying some excellent things, and I appreciate it. But I want to talk to the mental health issue. Not just in the context of dramatic major trauma, but in the context of other things you said that I think everyone is aware of. That is, officers work a stressful job. They work ridiculous hours, unscheduled overtime, middle of the night. They are daily in face-to-face contact with the unhappiest people in society who are happy to share their unhappiness with the officer, and which just got worse because the officer's showing up. And that's daily stress. And this has, I think, as much to do with the stress problems that officers have, alcoholism, divorce, suicide, and all the rest. And one more, which is, you made that point, and that was perfect. You know, that the cop, you know, I saw those videos of the pool party, and I did not know that, and I appreciate knowing that. Because the guy just looked like a racist jerk. Okay, he was beating on a 14-year-old skinny little girl in a bikini. It was just, there was no justification for it at all. And I'm glad to hear he got fired. You know, I'm sorry for the horrible thing he went through, and I understand it. But that brings me to the point that I drew from reading the report, which was the recommendation, I believe, that every department have a yearly screening for every employee. Not to say, are you crazy? You know, are you dangerous? But just to say, how are you doing? You know, we understand this is a severely stressful job. We have given you enormous power, we've given you enormous responsibility, and we've put you in a really crappy position a lot of the time. So we want to check and see how you're doing. And if, in fact, as a result of the evaluation, it's decided that going around the streets with a .40 caliber Glock on your hip is probably not the best thing for everyone because you're really stressed out, then that's a work-involved stress injury, and the person who has suffered it needs to be taken care of. But please, take away the Glock. Because that, there has to be, it's not just, you know, this guy has been through a horrible incident. This guy has done something that is traumatic, so let's check. But just a standard, yearly, every year, how you doing? Okay, you doing good? Having a little problem? Let's talk about it. So that the departments know and can weed out these things, because I am convinced that the bulk of these incidents that I've seen are officers who are not sick, sadistic individuals who join the force for a chance to kick somebody's butt. They're people who have been yelled at just 15 times today, and the 16th one they haul off and slug somebody. But we pay for it. We really don't want people who are in that condition who will go off on somebody. We would like to have that dealt with. And this is a way that it could be done. And it is not to put a stigma on the officers or the individual officer. It's part of the job. Stress. And stress adds up and it wears you down. One more thing, which is training. Policy is important. Getting the policy right and what we want done. That's public's expectations. That's how the department's organized. Training is important. Although I was worried about one thing which I heard, which is that a lot of the training is centralized, so the departments, I understand there's little departments that could never afford to do real training. But if the training is all done out of town, but the policy is made here, there can be problems because I believe the re-engineering training report talked about how a lot of what actually is training comes from the culture, the 21-foot rule, where no department taught shoot anybody who's within 21 feet with an edged weapon, but the word got out everywhere. So what goes on in the locker room, which is important, is what's on the policy paper. But the final leg of this stool is consequences. Since you've read the policy and you've had the training, you don't do it. You do something else. Because this is the way we've always done it. You know. Some people just need to be hit upside the head once in a while. If that happens, the DA won't look at it, the officer said he felt threatened, the department won't ding the guy. The reaction of a lot of the public is, nothing's changed. There's been talk, there's been smiles, there's been training, there's been policy, there's been pronouncements, but if someone ignores all this and they're still employed on the force and they get away with it, what's the message, both to the people of the force and to the public? Thank you, and I really appreciate allowing me to speak.
Well, I mean, he raises some good points. You know, I mean, we recommend, for example, you know, the periodic psychological screening, but trying to actually do it is a different matter. I mean, I mentioned before, Philly, for an example, 6,800 people. You just couldn't practically do it. Now, there are situations where you can relieve an individual of their police powers, at least in the places where I've worked. I don't know what the law is here. And that means you take away their gun, you take away their badge, and you get whatever, you know, either pending discipline or maybe they're sent for psychological screening, things of that nature. I'm not familiar with the process here, but The other issue around training, not every department has the resources to have their own in-house training. Most states, I imagine Oregon does, have a police officer standard training board of some kind, so that there is some standardization of training. Some of those boards are allow some flexibility. The one in Pennsylvania, for an example, you really got to kind of fight to get some training that may be relevant to Philadelphia, but not necessarily relevant to some of the more rural parts of the Commonwealth. But we're able to because it's not one size fits all, you know. We police very diverse communities. So that's always going to be an issue, I think. Some places have gone toward regional training centers, but you still aren't doing your own training for your own department because you simply don't have the resources to do it. I mean, most places would love to be able to do it, but it would require a whole lot more folks, for example, than what you have here in Eugene, in order to do that. Yeah.
I hope this isn't too far off topic. I understand that 21st century policing is really tied into the police departments and the interactions with communities, but I think my question, maybe comment, plays a significant role. It definitely plays a role in officer wellness. But I think morale is a little bit different. Did you guys have any input on morale within organizations? Again, I think it plays into a little bit of officer wellness from command staff down.
Yeah, I mean, I know Sean is our union guy there, so he deals with that more than I do, but it's something I've always taken very seriously in the departments I've been in. It's a hard thing to gauge, and it's a hard thing to measure. To really get your handle, get your fingers on just exactly, how are police officers feeling about a given thing, and it's a very difficult thing to deal with. But I do have some ideas on some things that can be done. But
Yeah, I think the key is both in building and maintaining morale goes back to internal procedural justice, and just like we would advocate, and we do advocate, that, and we didn't touch on this in the summary, but it is in the task force report, engaging with the community on things like changing your policy. We also advocate that you need to engage with the rank and file officers. And that's part of building morale as well, not only building morale, but building kind of a team. If you're going to have a change in your use of force policy, you got to run that by the union, you got to run that by your officers, you got to give them an opportunity to give you feedback, just like we would advocate that you give the community the opportunity to give feedback. It's kind of like, I wouldn't impose on a bunch of doctors how they're going to do exams. I don't do the exams. You guys are professionals. You're police officers. If there's going to be a change in policy and practice, you need to be advised about that. You need to have the opportunity to say, wait a second, that sounds good, except for like this one part, this isn't going to work. And here's why. And so from my standpoint, the way to build and keep morale is to make sure that you're engaging the officers as an employer, and to make sure that just like the person doesn't care if they got a ticket or not, it's how if they feel they were treated fairly, how does the officer feel that they're treated? And that's one of the things that I have talked about a lot over the last couple of years. We got a ton of research submitted to us as part of as written evidence for the task force. One of the, and we took a lot of oral testimony, 130 witnesses, I think. Yeah. So one of the things that we learned was a study was done of police officers, and they were asked a myriad of questions. And one of the things that they were asked to do is identify what the largest, you're going to like this because you were just talking about stress, what the largest stressor in their life, what the cause of stress was related to their employment. What do you think it was?
IAs.
It was not that I'm going to be involved in a shooting. It was not walking up to a car at night. It was not, it was my biggest concern, the biggest cause of stress for me at work is if I make an honest mistake, I don't think my employer will treat me fairly. That was the number one cause of stress. Think about all of the dangerous stuff that you do as a police officer, and that's what you would, I'm thinking like marriage, struggling with alcohol abuse or something. No, I'm afraid of what my employer will do. And so that's indicative of a real serious problem. And there's departments now that fairly or unfairly are under a lot of scrutiny. Chicago's one of them, probably under the most scrutiny out of any department in the United States right now. And I'm telling you firsthand, because I work in Chicago, it's a problem. I mean, the morale there is really, really bad. And for all of the reasons that I just stated. So that is woven through the task force report, and we do talk about it, but maybe not in terms of, this is good for morale. We don't say anything along those lines, but what we say is the department should operate in this way. And if they do, then morale isn't an issue, because officers feel like they have a voice, their voice is heard, that they're treated fairly, that's, if they have a concern, that their concern will be addressed. I mean, it's not rocket science.
Well, I mean, that's why we included that internal procedural justice in the report, because I think it's very important. It's just like you were talking about mass incarceration. In a sense, I mean, police departments tend to be very punitive. I mean, we got rules and regulations. You do this wrong, this is how long we're going to suspend you, this is what we're going to do. I mean, we're very punishment driven, And so are there alternatives to incarceration? For minor infractions, are there alternatives to discipline? If the goal is to change behavior, then what's the best way of going about changing that behavior? Is it suspending somebody for 3 days, or is it doing something other than that if it results in changed behavior? Now, I'm not talking about frequent flyers, the guys are constantly screwing up. I'm talking about people who aren't always coming in front of you for various forms of discipline. The other part of that is having your voice heard, and something, it doesn't have to be anything major. For an example, when Freddie Gray died as a result of being put in the back of a police wagon and so forth, somehow got injured and winds up dying. So I read that, and the first question I had at my next staff meeting was, what do our wagons look like? How do we restrain prisoners in the back of our wagons, And I found out that we did not have adequate restraints in all of our police wagons. We didn't have padding on the walls, because part of that problem was apparently, he slid and there were some indentations to show that he hit his head on the front part of the wagon. So we redesigned our wagons, right? We put padding in there, we made sure we had restraints and all that sort of thing. So when we got the first prototype out, I haven't worked a wagon in 30 some odd years, maybe probably like 40 some years. So when I called the wagon crew in off the street, and I said, hey guys, take a look at this. What do you think? And they looked at the new wagon, they made a couple suggestions. We didn't have enough equipment storage for them in the front cabin and all this kind of stuff. But the fact that they actually were asked their opinion, because they're the ones going to be driving the doggone thing. I ain't driving it, right? I got feedback on it. I mean, that sort of thing means a lot. When you start asking them, we get new cars in, pull one in a lot, call a car in off the street. Hey, is this thing too small? I mean, cars getting smaller and cops get wider. They get bigger. And we cram more and more equipment in these cars, and we got everybody in there like that, right? And so
he was not referring to me when he said that.
And so, by calling them in and having them take a look at a couple different models of cars that we're thinking about buying, and it doesn't take much for word to get around. One thing that I enjoyed more than anything, we did it in DC, did not do it in Philly. And that's where our business community in DC played a role. The Hotel Association every month hosted a luncheon where we could pick out of each of the districts, you know, an officer and that was considered to be like, you know, officer of the month or whatever it might have been, as well as some of our civilian units. It wound up being like 10 or 12 people that we'd sit down and we'd have lunch together. And the Hotel Association rotated it around, so we were at a different hotel every month, you know. And after we ate and I give out awards, we just have conversation. And hey, how's the new radio system working? How's this? How's that? I was getting constant feedback from the people who are out there doing it. These are the ones that are out there really doing the job the right way for you, you know. Those kinds of things matter. And then when you start making some changes based on that input, don't think that stuff doesn't get around, because it does get around. So sometimes it's the little things, I think, in terms of my voices being heard. You know, I mentioned that this wasn't working. We had dead zones in this particular area of the city. Those dead zones get fixed because we put a repeater out there. And now you don't have the dead zone anymore. Because I don't know about here in Eugene, but in my departments, and you sit around talking to your command folks, they tell you a lot of what you want to hear, not necessarily what you need to hear. And so getting out there and hearing from the people that actually have to do the job every day makes a tremendous difference. You listen to your command folks too. So it's like the old Reagan said, trust but verify, right? And so make sure for yourself this stuff's working the way it needs to work. Because otherwise you probably don't find out about it until it totally collapses or until something springs. So morale is elusive, but there are little things you can do, I think, to really kind of improve it. Cops are never going to be totally happy. What's the old saying? You know, two things cops don't like: the way things are and change. And that's pretty true, right? And so you gotta, that's part of the program too. But you know, you got to filter it out, because some of the concerns are very legitimate. If you don't pay attention to it, it'll sneak up on you.
All right, questions? Well, I have one then. So, I wasn't planning to, but I wrote it down just in case. One of the things that you talked about a lot was the youth component and making sure that we're connecting with youth in terms of what we're thinking about. Was there any work done or any analysis that you guys received that had to do with early intervention from the time maybe a 5, 6, 7, or 8-year-old and the programs that they're introduced to and the relationship that they start having with police officers to try to help the long-term trajectory around not getting into a life of crime or falling into bad patterns? Was there anything that you looked at along that line that talked to that prevention aspect?
We didn't look specifically at that, but the original concept of DARE, for an example, now DARE's been proven to be is less effective than people were making it out to be in a lot of places, but the original concept came out of LA, actually tracked kids over an extended period of time in multiple grades. And so I believe that kind of exposure could have been very, very positive. I think school resource officers, for an example, that are assigned to elementary, middle schools, things like that. I still remember the police officer's name that worked in the high school I went to, for an example. Never had any interactions with him on the negative side, I might add. But the way he carried himself, the way he handled himself, and so forth, I remember to this day. So I was kind of like exposed on the fringes, but those kinds of things matter, I think, when it comes to building relationships. But relationships are fragile. It doesn't, I mean, they got a life outside of that school. They're not in contact with police constantly. And so I think we have to recognize just how fragile it really is and really do what we can to try to build relationships. Just raising my own boy, I mean, you know, the gap is there. I mean, the way you communicate, everything. I mean, my son's constantly telling me, Dad, why you call? Just text me. I'm not that comfortable with, you know. I got a text from him one time. He's a grown man now. He's an ATF agent. But he was a kid growing up, I get a text from him, "Dad, what's for dinner?" I almost texted him back until I realized he was upstairs. Man, you better come down here and take a look and see what, but I mean, it's just different. It's just different. And so we all come from our own generations, and so the way we relate to young people. And so you have a meeting around young people. Who's usually sitting around the table? Adults. I mean, everybody's voice needs to be heard because they have a totally different perspective. And that's where the value of having, youth committees, teenagers, preteen. You mentioned that 18 to 26-year-old group, which is a tough demographic, very tough demographic, but need to have a seat at the table. And so it's not one size fits all. We gotta find ways to have those voices heard, and respect their voices, because it adds value to what we're trying to accomplish. And that's a big thing. You gotta respect it. It's not just enough to listen. You have to actually respect what they're saying. You may not always agree, and it may not lead to actually do anything. Maybe it's not something that's necessarily something that you're going to do, but at least you give them the respect of being able to voice their opinions.
One thing too, we did recommend that departments create opportunities for police officers to engage with youth at all ages in a non-enforcement way. And so some of the things that we've talked about, you may have heard me talk about this before, is programs similar to what the fire service does, where they will send someone, and there are police departments that are doing this now. I hope more will do that. More will do it, but they actually will come to a kindergarten class and in plain clothes and talk to the kids and maybe read them a story or something, and then leave the room and say, I'm going to be right back. And they'll leave the room and go put their uniform on and then come back into the room and explain to them that they're a police officer. If you ever get lost, you can come to somebody that is wearing this uniform, and that, those kind of things. But they start early, and then they touch every 3 to 4 years until that child is in the junior high school. And so, where they start very soft in kindergarten, then maybe 3rd grade, they actually wear their uniform when they come in and talk to them about their job and what's going on. A lot of times they'll incorporate a canine. If they have a canine program and it's not a bite dog, you don't want to send a bite dog to school. But those are really popular programs now, and that is one thing that we strongly recommended in the task force report, was that departments create more opportunities for engagement between police officers and kids. So the LA is doing amazing work in this, and with their youth engagement program and their violence reduction program. They've made a huge investment in having police officers. They actually have police officers assigned. Part of their job is to coach like Little League football and Little League baseball teams, and it's really turned things around.
I will. I think one of the things you touched on a little bit, but I think it gets missed in the conversation. And you talk about state training agencies, and I'm the police officer. I'm outside. I'm looking through the window of the state training facilities, and to me, it seems more like a military boot camp than it actually does in terms of becoming a guardian in the community. Or they're boot camping all day, and then at night they have classes, which if you boot camped all day, your mind's not real sharp in the evening, kind of thing. But I think we also missed the point about the whole fear factor thing. My heart picks up a little bit if a police car pulls in behind me. And I think that happens to everybody. I've been stopped 1 or 20 times in my life. And that dynamic never changes, because I know that that officer has more power than anybody individually in this nation, including the military. They can ruin my life if they want to on a dark and stormy night or even on a clear sunny day. They can take away my freedom. They can take away my job. They can destroy my life if they so choose to. And probably or more than likely be believed in that court system. And I think that, and when I talk to some of our officers, it's like, well, I never really looked at it that way. Because they just come to work, they want to collect a paycheck, they want to go home safe. And I wish there was more emphasis on that, of that tremendous power, you know, that they have, and an appreciation for that, and an understanding of how that impacts the average person like me. And I don't see a lot of that. I don't see a lot of talk about that.
Yeah, because we don't have it in there. And if we had it to do over again and weren't so pressed for time, there's a lot of things we would have had in there. But that's one that's, there are two things that you raise that are critically important. One, I don't think in most academies, I can't speak for I haven't seen them all, but we don't deal with power and authority the way we ought to deal with it. You got 20-year-old, 21-year-old men and women coming into the profession. They're given guns, badges, souped-up car, and then we wonder why sometimes things go bad. And we don't spend enough time not only talking about the role of police in a democratic society, but also power and authority that goes with, and the responsibility that goes with it, and how easy it is to abuse it. And just deal with that issue head on, and how it's perceived by the public. And I think that's very important. I also think we need to rethink, to a large extent, the model we use in training. Most training academies do look like boot camps. and because, you know, historically we've kind of modeled ourselves after military, but we're not soldiers, we're police. And so I think we lose some good candidates because of that sort of thing. It's one thing for me to talk about, the guardian mindset, and a lot of chiefs now talk about that. Oh, we want service-oriented people and so forth. But then look at your recruitment video. And I looked at mine in Philadelphia. What are we? We talk all this stuff, and then we got SWAT, we got the bomb squad, we got helicopters, we got all the TV stuff, right? And the music to go with it. And then we wonder. I mean, you attract. Not that that's not part of policing, but if what you're looking for are people that do have that guardian mindset, that are service oriented, that we got to rethink that, because we're sending so many mixed messages. And a lot of people that come to us, they don't have any relatives in the business. They don't. I mean, they don't really. Their view of policing comes from movies and TV. And so we need to really kind of think about all that. But we can't get so carried away that. I had a deputy that we got into a discussion around this whole warrior versus guardian thing, and it's really not a either or. I mean, I think he put it best. He said you need people with the mindset of a guardian but the heart of a warrior, because there are times when to get up and to do this job over and over again and be resilient takes the heart of a warrior. You got to be able to get up off the deck and keep going. You do have to chase people down that alley at night with a gun. I mean, those are the kinds of things that sometimes you're called upon to do, but it's not the majority of the time. It's not the majority of the time. So you got to have people with that right balance, that right understanding, and that's hard. And that's very hard to do.
I have what I take to be a related matter. First, let me say I really enjoyed the presentation and the spark. Some good ideas from you. I've read the original document, and I had never somehow managed to connect the different pillars as well as you have done for me. So that's great. As a EPD volunteer, I served as one of the trainers for our local police legitimacy and procedural justice training. We started that training, it was my assignment, with a bit of history of police abuses in this country, starting back in the civil rights era. We had a case from Portland. We then added I think, maybe 3 incidents from Eugene that gave the public, maybe not the greatest impression of Eugene policing. But we didn't take the heavy duty ones. We didn't, in my opinion, we didn't have the ones that really put a smirch on Eugene Police Department. And my personal feeling after the training was over that we should have done that. And that Eugene police officers should know the history, the local history. And of course, some of it is known, but by rumor and I've run into a few officers that don't know some of the local things. It would seem to me awful to have an officer out on a call and be faced with an angry citizen who refers back to something that happened in not even where and he doesn't know anything about it, he or she doesn't know anything. So you mentioned the importance of the sense of history for officers. And what's your perception or persuasion on this matter of the training, the kind of training we offer, and whether it should be, well, I think more hard-hitting or more, whether we should take the hard cases in our presentation?
I think hard cases with valuable lessons learned is something that can be that can be useful. I think if we're able to somehow get police to see policing through the eyes of those being policed, if that makes any sense, I think we start to accomplish things. Okay, it's not how we see ourselves; it's how others see us. And if we can put ourselves, depending on what community we're working with, but see through their eyes how they view policing, then I think we start to have legitimate discussions. I think it's also important to recognize the good work and the positive things that are going on out there so that you have some balance. Because you can point out the hundreds of videos that may be negative, but it's not balanced with the millions of interactions that take place between police and community members over a period of time where you don't hear about it because nothing happened. And so, there's some good stuff out there too. So there needs to be some balance there. And I think that's important that we raise these issues but have discussion. It's not to just, it's not to indict or belittle or do anything. It's just, let's talk about this. Why is stop and frisk such a hot topic in some areas? I actually banned the word stop and frisk from my department, and Terry stops are what they are. And so, a stop doesn't necessarily follow with a search. That's a whole different discussion. But, how do we look through the eyes of the people being policed? And if we can somehow do that, because we all come from different backgrounds, right? And we see things differently. But we have to learn to view things through a different lens periodically. And sometimes it's that tough discussion, that hard discussion has to happen. And so I think that's, you don't have to get into start naming folks and all that kind of stuff, but you can take situations and scenarios, everybody knows, and lay it out there.
And there is some, I see it gets so heavy.
Well, it does, but that's why you gotta have some balance. Because if all you do is talk about all the negative stuff, you talk about morale, hell, you can be there depressed, right? We've got a job to do too. And listen, I spent 47 years in active law enforcement. I'm proud of that. I would not change it for anything in the world. I think if I had another 47 to do, I'd do it. And so, am I aware of baggage and issues? Yeah. But I also have seen the good side of things and the stuff. People talk about, changing culture. Not everything in a culture is bad. If we're going to address those things that really need to be focused on, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because there's more good in police culture than there is negative in police culture. And so let's work on those things that need improvement. But let's not just act like it's just all bad and all, like a malignant tumor or something like that. Because it's not. It's not.
There's some cutting edge training being developed using virtual reality glasses that addresses a lot of these issues as well. So I think, I know the Police Foundation is doing some work in that area, and I know there's some companies that are actually developing the training so that you can actually put the virtual reality glasses on a trainee, and they assume the role of whatever that person is. It's really, I've seen a demo of it. It's really incredible, and it's very realistic.
What I was going to say too is, because you mentioned the body-worn cameras, in Madison, Wisconsin, they're not going to have body-worn cameras because a study out of DC said it didn't change officers' behaviors. So Madison doesn't want it now because it's not a gotcha tool. Because, as you said, 99.9% of the police work is done is very good. And if that's your sole purpose for having body cams is gotcha, well, then no, it's probably not going to work. But maybe the chief will agree with me. It's maybe even the union guys. It helps with training and understanding situations and going back through a situation, even understanding what you did yourself when you were in that high adrenaline situation. And I think that, again, I think we've kind of missed the boat on what the purpose of the body cam was supposed to be. And there's too many people in this country think that its sole purpose is a gotcha. We've got you doing something wrong now, and we're going to nail you.
You know, I like to think about trying to find folks doing stuff right. I mean, and so, you know, it cuts both ways. Again, you know, but we have to be able to leverage technology any way we can, but do it in a way that's consistent with the Constitution. And with solid policies as to when it's appropriate to film, when it's not appropriate to film. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't, my house is not in the kind of shape where I want to have somebody in filming it every single day and then have people be able to watch it on late night TV that suffer from insomnia because somehow these things become public, you know, and so we need to think about this. And that's beyond police. That's our elected officials, that's our legal teams, that's everybody sitting down talking about, okay, how best do we use this? I happen to be a proponent of it, but, you know,
There's a new study out, CNA came out with yesterday that they did with Las Vegas that totally different.
Yeah, I read
results.
that
So,
too, yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I don't know that it's, I mean, the fact of the matter is, and I do come from a union background, in the departments that have deployed body cameras, over 80% of the cases where a citizen's complaint comes in, the camera exonerates the officer. Exonerates them. There's another maybe 10% where it could have handled the call better, but, you know, training issue or whatever. And then there's some cases where the officer screws up. But I'm telling you, from a business standpoint, if you were the business manager of a police union, you'd want every member wearing one of those cameras because you're not going to have to defend an officer 80% of the time that gets complained. It's just a...
Well, I dismiss a lot of complaints just because I have that now.
Exactly.
No, it's good stuff.
So just out of respect for everybody's time, we did say we were going to wrap up at 7:30, and really appreciate both of you being here. I know we've flown across country, and yeah, no, thank you.
Make sure your cars are out of that parking lot by 8 o'clock.
That's right. No, much appreciated. Chuck, just wanted to ask you for one closing comment, if you would. I know that you and I talked a little bit about the broadness of the work that you guys did, but it's not the only things that we need to be thinking about.
No, it's not the only thing, and we did talk about that. We had a very compressed time frame, and again, I thought originally, and I think most of our team members thought, we give a basic report and then build out from there. Just because it's not in a report doesn't mean it's not good. It's not something that should be considered. Because there are a lot of things we didn't consider. I mean, we would have gone back to recruitment, hiring, retention, staffing. There are all kinds of things that if we had more time, we would have addressed. But, we didn't have that time. And so we dealt with what we could deal with. But, yeah. It's not the end-all, end-all.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that.
Yeah.
But thank you guys, and thank you guys for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Sitting here listening to the chief. That chief that I first worked with. I wouldn't change the role of the Longer than.
Oh, Michael, good to see you.
Good seeing you. Here's something.
Hey, Travis. Good, how are you?
I'm sure you already know this. When we first started with I can't tell you how many people were
Component to the community.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Concept of
I don't know where you are with that.
Yeah, I just think that we need to not, I know it's really, what we're doing right now is pretty overwhelming. Trying to finish every Friday. So as we think about branching out, I think that's the opportunity.
I remember the conversation.
One of the things that we're
We were finding every time, oh,
program, but there may be some
guy was breaking in time and all kinds of shit like that. You can't get a consistent program now without
I've got some.
things change, absolutely. And they see the value coming.
So here you need president.
Oh, good to meet you. Well, anything new, it's going to cost.
Well, like you said, you know. Yep. That's the only.
The only thing that would be worse than part of it, I walk by
Right.
a 19-year-old slinging pot, I know what it works every day.
Right.
And every now and then I just go, do you know who I am? And you
Please don't do
do it
this.
directly in front of me. And there was one time where he was literally handing it for under 18s.
Thank you.
I do think you might downstream. How long
My favorite part. When we use four-letter words.
The chronic low-level offenders that I feel like the community court is 22.
Yes, I'll be upstairs and then.
So I'd rather not deal with